The transparency of life. Cataracts is a model of age-related disease. Cataracts can disappear when the eye's metabolic condition is corrected. A supply of energy is essential to maintain the transparent structure. Lactic acid increases as carbon dioxide decreases during a typical energy deficiency. Deficient thyroid and the resulting excess of cortisol relative to pregnenolone and progesterone define the energy deficiency. Increased lactate relative to CO2 in the cell alters cell pH and electrical charge, causing swelling. Swelling and increased water content characterize the cataract. High altitude is inversely related to cataracts, despite the known role of sunlight in causing cataracts. This is a strong confirmation of the protective role of carbon dioxide. In the markets around Lake Piscuro, they sell green transparent fish, about 6 inches long. When cooked, the meat is white, like ordinary fish. Most fish fillets are a little translucent, but are at least cloudy, and usually pink by transmitted light. I don't know how the transparent fish work, because it seems that the blood and the network of blood vessels needed to sustain muscle activity would diffuse the light. Anyway, cooking disrupts the mysteriously ordered state of water and proteins that makes them transparent, roughly the way egg white loses its transparency when it is cooked. I have never heard a convincing explanation for the opacity of cooked egg white, either, but anything that disrupts the original structuring of the protein-water interaction will destroy the transparency. Around 1970, I used a technique called nuclear magnetic resonance, NMR, which is the basis for the procedure known as MRI, magnetic resonance imaging, to compare the state of water in old, uterine tissue and young tissue. Old tissue predictably contains less water than young tissue, but I found that the water in the old tissue was in a relatively free and uncontrolled state. When tissue swells and takes up water, more of the water is likely to be in this uncontrolled state, and this is one of the things that makes MRI so useful, because tumors, for example, show up vividly because of their large amount of uncontrolled, unbound water. I suspect that the measurements I made on uterine tissue showed a localized effect that opposed the general trend toward increased dryness with aging. In the case of cataracts, this is clearly the case. Most of the lens becomes drier with age, but at a certain point there is a reversal, and some of the tissue takes up too much water. That's why I refer to cataracts as a model of age-related disease, rather than as a model of aging. In this sense, I am including them among the inflammatory diseases of aging: colitis, arthritis, and cancer, for example. MRI now can show developing cataracts before they are visible, because of increased water content in the area. The lens of the eye is a fairly dense, tough, transparent living structure, which can develop opaque areas, cataracts, as a result of old age, poisoning, radiation, disease, or trauma. The varieties of cataracts relate to the causes. Most of the oxidative metabolism of the lens is in or near the epithelial layer that surrounds it. Old age cataracts most often begin in this region. Although the efficient oxidative energy metabolism occurs near the surface of the lens, there is a constant flow of fluid through the lens, entering it mainly in the front and back, and leaving on its sides or equator, considering the front and back as the poles. The direction light passes through. Oxygen and nutrients are supplied to the lens by way of this circulation of fluid, entering mostly from the aqueous humor in front, which also supplies the cornea, but also from the vitreous humor behind the lens. When the flow of nutrients and energy is impaired, the organized state of the protein and water system in the cell is damaged, and an excess of water is taken up by the cells, as the protein content decreases. The loss of organization causes light to be dispersed, with a loss of transparency. The lens of the eye is usually treated as something so specialized that it is hardly considered to be part of our living substance, just as dentistry has tended to treat teeth as inert things to be approached mechanically, rather than physiologically. The lens circulatory system is very interesting, because of what it says about the nature of living substance. In the absence of blood vessels, it provides its own flow of nutrients. This flow is reminiscent of the flow of substances through the dentine channels of the teeth, through the axons of nerves, two-way transport in a very narrow channel, and, in some ways, recalls the flow of fluids in plants, called guttation, drop formation, which is disturbing to botanists, because it is contrary to the textbook descriptions of proper physiology. The flow of material through lens cells, dentine canals, and nerve axons should allow us to gain a perspective in which these observable processes become a model for other biological situations in which transport occurs. Kidney, intestine, or the skin of frogs, for example, in which water, ions, and other solutes are moved in considerable quantities. When cells metabolize, they create gradients. In the cell, electrical, chemical, osmotic, and thermal gradients, for example, are constantly being produced or maintained. The whole substance of the cell is involved in its life processes. Because of prejudices introduced 200 years ago, the life of the cell has been relegated to its membrane, where hypothetical membrane pumps reside, and its nucleus. When the term cell, hollow space, came into use instead of corpuscle, little body, a mindset came into existence that discounted the importance of most of the living material, and claimed that it was a mere random solution. Random solutions don't do much. The wonderful membrane under the direction of the nucleus, and its set of instructions, took care of everything. Whenever assimilation or excretion took place, it was explained by inventing a property possessed by the cell membranes. Therefore, we have physiology textbooks that have an unfounded explanation for everything. Before Copernicus, planetary movements were described as arbitrary epicycles. They didn't make sense, but people studied them and felt that they were important. Membrane physiology is the modern equivalent of the Ptolemaic epicycles. We know that glucose can be metabolized into pyruvic acid, which, in the presence of oxygen, can be metabolized into carbon dioxide. Without oxygen, pyruvic acid can be converted into lactic acid. The production of lactic acid tends to increase the pH inside the cell, and its excretion can lower the pH outside the cell. The decrease of carbon dioxide that generally accompanies increased lactic acid corresponds to increased intercellular pH. Carbon dioxide binds to many types of protein, for example by forming carbamino groups, changing the protein conformation, as well as its electrical properties, such as its isoelectric point. With increased pH, cell proteins become more strongly ionized, tending to separate, allowing water to enter the spaces, in the same way a gel swells in an alkaline solution. The Bohr-Haldane effect describes the fact that hemoglobin releases oxygen in the presence of carbon dioxide, and releases carbon dioxide in the presence of oxygen. When oxygen is too abundant, it makes breathing more difficult, and one of its effects is to cause carbon dioxide to be lost rapidly. At high altitude, more carbon dioxide is retained, and this makes cellular respiration more efficient. The importance of carbon dioxide to cell control process, and to the structure of the cell and the structure of proteins in general, suggested that degenerative diseases would be less common at high altitude. Wounds and broken bones heal faster at high altitude, but the available statistics are especially impressive in two of the major degenerative conditions, cancer and cataracts. The two biggest studies of altitude and cataracts, involving 12,217 patients in one study, and 30,565 lifelong residents in a national survey in Nepal, showed a negative correlation between altitude and the incidence of cataract. At high altitude, cataracts appeared at a later age. In Nepal, an increase of a few thousand feet in elevation decreased the incidence of cataracts by 2.7 times. At the same time, it was found that exposure to sunlight increased the incidence of cataracts, and since the intensity of ultraviolet radiation is increased with altitude, this makes the decreased incidence of cataracts even more important. All of the typical causes of cataracts, aging, poisons, and radiation, decrease the formation of carbon dioxide, and tend to increase the formation of lactic acid. Lactic acid excess is typically found in eyes with cataracts. The electrical charge on the structural proteins will tend to increase in the presence of lactic acid, or the deficiency of carbon dioxide, and the increase of charge will tend to increase the absorption of water. The lens can survive for a considerable length of time in vitro, since it has its own circulatory system, so it has been possible to demonstrate that changes in the composition of the fluid can cause opacities to form, or to disappear. Oxidants, including hydrogen peroxide which occurs naturally in the aqueous humor, can cause opacities to form quickly, but they will also disappear quickly in a solution that restores metabolic energy. The lens regulates itself powerfully. For example, it will swell when put into a hypotonic solution, but will quickly adapt, returning to approximately its normal size. Several years ago, I saw what appeared to be oxidant-induced cataracts. Two women had a very sudden onset of cataracts, and I asked about their diet and supplements. It turned out that one of them had begun taking 500 milligrams of zinc daily a few months earlier, and the other had begun taking 600 milligrams of zinc and 250 milligrams of iron, on her doctor's recommendation, just a couple of months before the cataracts appeared. For some reason, there have been many nutritional supplements sold as cataract remedies in the form of eye drops. I suppose a trace of the material could diffuse through the cornea into the aqueous humor, where it might make a difference in the lens nutrient supply, but it seems more reasonable to treat the body as a whole, nourishing every part in a balanced way. Besides living at a high elevation or breathing extra carbon dioxide, the most certain way to increase the amount of carbon dioxide in the eye, and to prevent an excess of lactic acid, is to make sure that your thyroid function is adequate. One man who took thyroid, USP, and vitamin E, told me that his cataracts had regressed, but I haven't known other people who tried this. If a person already has distinct cataracts, it might be worthwhile to experiment with a relatively high degree of hypercapnia, for example, breathing a 5% mixture of CO2 in air. Carbon dioxide, at higher levels than are normal at sea level, has a profound effect on free radicals, reducing the free radical activity in the blood to approximately zero, before reaching the level that produces acidosis. There are several situations in which carbon dioxide affects the hydration, water content, of biological materials, that I think give an insight into its effects on the lens. Hydrophilic glycoproteins are involved in each case. These are proteins with attached chains of sugar molecules that make them associate with a large amount of water. In the cornea, increased carbon dioxide strongly protects against swelling. The bulk of the cornea is a connective tissue that is relatively simple and passive compared to the compact cellular structure of the lens. And it is conventional to describe the thin layers of cells on the inside and outside of the cornea as being responsible for the water content of the underlying substance. However, even when the epithelial cells are removed, it has been demonstrated that carbon dioxide is able to prevent corneal swelling. The roles of bicarbonate and CO2 in transendothelial fluid movement and control of corneal thickness. Bronchial mucus secretions are an even simpler system, so it is very interesting that carbon dioxide is recognized as the most powerful regulator of their behavior. This has important implications for cystic fibrosis or mucoviscidosis. Among inhalants, steam and carbon dioxide have been found to be excellent expectorants. Relative humidity above 85% liquefies sputum, decreases its viscosity. Carbon dioxide is the most effective agent of all. It not only lowers the viscosity of tenacious sputum, thereby facilitating expectoration, but it decreases the volume of sputum by promoting its active resorption by bronchial mucosa. A 5 to 10% concentration of carbon dioxide is adequate and well tolerated if administered at intervals. Oxygen has been shown to be an anti-expectorant and has effects opposite to those of carbon. Oxygen tends to displace carbon dioxide from tissue and is a source of free radicals. One of the best-known free radical scavenging substances that has been widely used as a drug is iodide. It has been used to treat asthma, parasites, syphilis, cancer, Graves' disease, periodontal disease, and arteriosclerosis. Diseases that produce tissue overgrowth associated with inflammation granulomas have been treated with iodides, and although the iodide doesn't necessarily kill the germ, it does help to break down and remove the granuloma. Leprosy and syphilis were among the diseases involving granulomas that were treated in this way. In the case of tuberculosis, it has been suggested that iodides combine with unsaturated fatty acids which inhibit proteolytic enzymes, and thus allow for the removal of the abnormal tissue. In experimental animals, iodide clearly delays the appearance of cataracts. Inflammation, edema, and free radical production are closely linked, and are produced by most things that interfere with energy production. Endotoxin, produced by bacteria, mainly in the intestine, disrupts energy production and promotes maladaptive inflammation. The wide spectrum of benefit that iodide has, especially in diseases with an inflammatory component, suggests first that it protects tissue by blocking free radical damage, but it also suggests the possibility that it might specifically protect against endotoxin. There are subtler differences in transparency that probably have a variety of causes, but differences in water content or hydration might be involved in the lower transparency that has been seen in women's lenses. Estrogen, which tends to produce edema and hypotonic body fluids, also increases prolactin production. Prolactin is involved in water and electrolyte regulation, and it has been found to accelerate the development of experimental cataracts. Siang, et al., 1987. These hormones are associated with the calcification of soft tissues, and cataracts contain very high levels of calcium. Averichin and Rall, 1987, Hightower and Reddy, 1982. Estrogen is strongly associated with free radical processes, calcium mobilization, and acetylcholine release, all of which are involved in the process of excitotoxicity. Alvarez, 1996, have shown a possible involvement of acetylcholine in calcium mobilization in the lens. Serotonin is another regulatory substance strongly associated with prolactin and estrogen, and it also can be involved in disrupting the metabolism of the lens. This is one of the potential dangers in using supplemental tryptophan. Old age commonly involves some changes in the color of tissues, loss of pigment from hair and skin, with appearance of new pigment, age pigment, lipofuscin, which may appear as liver spots. But there is also a tendency of the toenails, fingernails, teeth, and lenses to turn yellow or brown. Some of this dark material seems to be aged pigment, derived from unsaturated fatty acids, but other components have been identified, for example, tryptophan from damaged proteins. The Maillard reaction, similar to the browning that occurs in bread crust, has often been mentioned in relation to aging, and involves the combination of protein amino groups with sugars. But the browning of the lens tends to be associated with the general age-related drying of the lens. It isn't irregularly distributed, and it doesn't significantly harm vision. When I first heard about the age-related browning of the lens, I thought that the experience of colors would be affected, so I devised a test in which the relative darkness of blue and yellow could be judged in comparison with a graded strip of shades of gray. After people of ages ranging from 10 to 80 had given exactly the same matches, I realized that the nervous system probably corrects for the yellow filter effect of the brown lens. The browning of tissues will be the subject of another newsletter. Among the interesting causes of cataracts: tamoxifen in hypotonic fluids, sodium deficiency, toxicity of tryptophan, oxidants, metals, hydrogen peroxide, PUFA, diabetes, photosensitizers and sunlight, excess calcium, deficient magnesium, excess cortisol, radiation. Arachidonic and linoleic acids in other situations have been found to block cells' regulation of their water content. Hypothyroidism tends to increase the activity of serotonin, estrogen, prolactin, calcium, and the tendency of tissues to retain water, and to decrease the level of ATP. Among the factors that probably have a role in preventing cataracts: thyroid, progesterone, pregnenolone, vitamin E, iodide, pyruvate. Increasing the carbon dioxide lowers the cell's pH and tends to resist swelling. Palmitic acid, a saturated fat that can be synthesized by our tissues, is normally oxidized by the lens. Calcium blockers experimentally prevent cataracts, suggesting that magnesium and thyroid, which also act to exclude calcium from cells, would have the same effect. Thyroid hormone is essential for maintaining adequate carbon dioxide production, for minimizing lactic acid, cortisol and prolactin, for regulating calcium and magnesium, for avoiding hypotonicity of the body fluids, and for improving the ratio of palmitic acid to linoleic acid.